This interview is with Jeffrey Fabian, one of the co-creators of APM Map, a site that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. Jeffrey is a full-time software engineer and helped build APM Map in his spare time. In this interview, we cover some of the technical decisions that he made, how he handled learning new technologies as part of the project, how he managed expectations and accountability while over the 5 months of development, and some of his takeaways regarding the product engineering relationship. Hope you enjoy.
Cool. Okay, so I guess we can start with just you introducing yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Fabian's full name, but co-creator of APM Map, software engineer at MailChimp, and yeah, like recent college grad last year.
Yeah. And so Jeff made APM Map, and so I want to talk with him, just on a couple of the questions around how he built it, some of the decisions he made, and some of his experiences working very closely. It was a two-person team, and working very closely with a PM counterpart to bring this side project to life. So the first question I want to ask you, so PMTL's audience is focused on introducing technical aspects of product management, right? So I was hoping that you could walk us through some of your technology choices and the decisions that you had to make while building APM Map, just to get us acquainted with the sort of things that we're working with.
Yeah. I think I'll preface the answer by being like, I think most of it were sort of uninformed decisions, right? This being a side project, this sort of being something I wanted to do out of exploration and curiosity. That was sort of kind of like the driving force from the get-go. So, part of it was like, okay, what am I sort of familiar with? So React was like an industry standard for front-end stuff. Material UI had like good docs and was also seemed to have a lot of popularity in the industry. So it had sort of enough support from a technical standpoint that I think a lot of engineers like for sure. And Gatsby, which is like the framework in which everything was built on, was super interesting to me. So I didn't know much about like static site generation, but the idea of basically having a web app, but having it be pre-built to have the kind of speed and snappiness of a static site seemed really appealing, and it seemed really to fit the bill here, right? We weren't doing anything super complicated. We kind of just wanted resources out there in the world, wanted it to be fast and accessible. So that's sort of the thought process that went through it. I think over time it turned out to be really well, like kind of fit our needs. But yeah, kind of makes sense so far.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that use a static site generator. I was hoping you could just elaborate a little bit on what does that mean? What sort of advantages do you gain by going in that direction?
Yeah. So I wish I brushed up on that a little bit, but since this is like a fairly new concept to me, but the idea is sort of like way back when, before every site was sort of a web app and had like fully fledged kind of application. It was just HTML, CSS, and like JavaScript functionality, and really just like given the bandwidth and then kind of where front end tech was, that was really all we needed. And so over time, the industry was like, whoa, we can do so much with JavaScript. We can do so much with like styling and make sites a lot more beautiful and dynamic. So the rise of React and the rise of kind of like newer front end technologies brought up this idea of like, okay, we are building something super powerful, but the web is still something that needs to be optimized for speed. And so static site generation is sort of a hybrid. It says, okay, let's have an app, but since we know the vast majority of stuff like that we'll need at the time that we have the code, let's take advantage of that. There's something called Webpack that I'm not super familiar with, but like it's pretty industry standard and kind of bundles your code in a logical way to make things efficiently build and understand dependencies. So altogether, it says, let's take this fully fleshed out application that offers a lot of functionality, but let's get a lot of that like logic out up front and then build something that's easily navigatable and like can be fast for a user experience. And so it's almost sort of like a pseudo compiled website. And I think what they call it is like hydration. So it like it's a web app insofar as like functionality, but it navigates as if it's just HTML and CSS.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing that you touched on in your answer was also that a lot of these concepts were new to you, and you were kind of exploring these as you went as well. And building side projects is something that I like to emphasize as a way of really developing your technical abilities. It's one of the most direct ways and efficient ways that you can understand a lot of these concepts yourself. So how did you handle kind of approaching this larger concept as a whole, as someone who doesn't have quite as much experience in this specific aspect? And what did you do when you got kind of stuck or frustrated, on a concept where you didn't quite know how to move forward, or you didn't know how to resolve some sort of bug or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what was nice about some of the upfront decisions I made was that these were kind of fields that were industry standards to a certain extent and like had a lot of community support, especially from the perspective of using Gatsby. Gatsby is like it's I don't know, is it fully open source, but it has a very, very strong open source community insofar as like there are constant issues being opened up, questions. So I think I was fortunate insofar as like when I ran into a bug, it was a bug that like somebody else had found at some point. Um, and it was I would often like find myself on pages 2, 3 years old, and like the things was eventually fixed, or someone found a really good workaround. So that was especially helpful. Um, on a more like spiritual note, I think that's like the day in the life of an engineer. Like you'll always find some bug, you'll always find something that's like, what the heck is going on? I don't get it. Um, so I think on that note, like just my some of my experience so far has been helpful insofar as like not panicking and not freaking out when none of it makes sense, because it never really makes sense in the beginning, and then over time it just sort of just keep doing. You learn as you go. So it's been pretty cool.
Yeah. I know in my past experience, side projects have a tendency to die a death by a thousand cuts, right? This one framework won't compile, or you can't find the latest version of this other framework, and like all these things kind of add up into like a larger snowball of, well, this is just not worth it anymore. I'm getting really, really frustrated.
Mhm.
So it's nice to hear that even as a professional software engineer, this is still something that can happen, and it's comes with developing software. It's kind of almost it's part of the job, right?
Yeah, and I'll just add that like a big part that helped was that I had Michelle by my side, right? My product manager, who like kind of like led the vision and thought a lot about like why we were doing the thing that we were doing. Because if it's just out of sheer enjoyment, which in large part that's how I started, you kind of like frustration seems to defeat the purpose. You're like, why am I doing this? This is frustrating. Side project goes into the parts bin. Um, but like having that larger goal for it helps kind of bring it to life and push forward.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned that. And I'm going to explore that a little bit more. As you mentioned, this is a two-person operation, you and Michelle, and you seem to take on a little bit more of the engineering side and Michelle more of the product side. But like with any sort of startup type of group, I'm sure there's lots of tasks and responsibilities that kind of bled over between your two defined roles, quote unquote. So I'm curious to know, like, what sort of things did you take on that you weren't expecting, or that like what elements of just running this project as such a lean team were you surprised by, found the hardest? Just kind of commentary on that.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely a super kind of flexible role definement throughout the whole thing. What I was most surprised at was my role as like a pseudo designer. So I'm actually like at my job, I'm kind of used to being like designs are kind of fleshed out and like some thinking has been thought through that. And like here's what they look like. And so like I don't really do much front end work professionally, but like in the bits that I have, it's sort of like this is what it looks like. You sort of just have to like reverse engineers with your eyes. Whereas for APM Map, I kind of like had to make decisions, right? I'm like, okay, how do I want this to look? Why am I designing it in that way? Like, and that of course kind of ties back into the whole cross-functional like product and engineering side. Like, what's easy, what's hard? Why would we even do that in the first place? And like, is it useful um, from like a feature perspective? So I definitely think a lot of times just like being so close to the code and seeing how things kind of move and shift. Like I basically had like a designer's eye as I was going through it. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's always an underlying importance of like, is it even worth it kind of thing? Because sometimes, and Michelle can attest to this, I would like go a little bit too far, and I would like be like, oh, this is so cool and animated, but it doesn't do much for a feature set. So, I was sort of like, oops, spent a little too much time on that. But that's where we ended up, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. That's great to hear, right? I think designs are always something that we can kind of start assuming that just because we've seen a lot of them, we know how to kind of generate them. But when the task comes, it's a totally different beast, right?
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of pivot back a little bit more to the engineering side, right? So you are basically the entire engineering team, where in a larger company, there are a couple of different roles that you might play, right? There's like the tech lead role, there's a straight up engineer, maybe even kind of like a scrum manager type role. What advice would you have for someone who is in like a one-man operation, rolling all these roles into yourself and having to make all these different decisions? How do you manage and balance those kind of conceptual responsibilities across each other?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. That there's like a two-part answer to that. One, it's like, how do I manage that within myself, and like one, how do I manage that between like whoever you're working with, right? In this case, me and another product manager. But I think the way I'd like summarize it is sort of like trying to find the balance between dreaming and building. And I say that because I think I'm especially the type of person that's sort of just like, I can't be thinking about ideation if I'm building something, right? Like those are two very different parts of my like brain, and the context switching would just drain me more than the actual doing. So I sort of had myself like a little schedule that worked, right? Like I'm like, ideation is important, right? Because you don't want to miss an opportunity to take something to the next level, right? Like, wow, this, I just connected these dots, and like I want to take note of that, and that's really cool. But it's also distracting, right? Like something about building, you just kind of like need to get in there, zone in, like figure out the bugs so that you can actually like make the thing come to life. So I definitely say like being cognizant of that. I guess it's just my way of saying like feature creep. um, but definitely being cognizant of that, because like it's tricky to find the balance between, and I personally love the term minimal lovable product. Is it? Uh,
Mhm.
I love it because I think viability is almost too constricting, especially if you like are invested and passionate about what you're building. It's like, it doesn't matter that it's viable. It doesn't matter that I can technically ship it. Like, I don't love it. And I think that's like an important thing that like Michelle and I had to balance as we were going through some of the ideation, cool ideas, but actually like building out things and working through logistics. But yeah, I think like just being really specific about which mode you're in, and like being explicit about that helps with like moving forward, but not closing all the doors around you as like ideas just flow in, right?
Yeah, I think the feature creep is like a super common, I guess, affliction that happens with side projects, right? Where you don't have maybe as strict of business goals or product requirements as you might have at work. And so it's super easy to kind of go crazy on animations, like you said, or these kind of fun little things that are fun to explore with, right? But if the goal is to build and launch a product like you two did, it does kind of get in the way of priorities and timelines and stuff. So you mentioned having these two concrete mindsets that you adopt, ideation and then execution. Um, did you have any other techniques that kind of kept the feature creep in check as you guys developed this over? How long was this overall process?
You mean like how long have you been building and thinking through
Yeah,
stuff, or maybe like 5 months, something like that?
yeah. So that's a pretty long time, right? I think even like at a company scale, 5 months for a project is pretty
Yeah.
meaningful. So how did you guys manage that over the entire course of the project, and obviously going forward as well?
I think what helped managing it is sort of, I don't know. It was tricky because we both had like a little bit, like we had like too much on our plates, right? In theory, like you can ideate and you can like optimize for what's important and prioritize for months, like to know and kind of understanding the business value or whatever value you're trying to create. And on my end, right, I talked about what what I would want to build and what, what seems feasible, what's easy, what can be better, optimizing little things here and there. I think what helped manage the whole thing and actually really come it together was creating really concrete milestones for ourselves, right? Because I was kind of skeptical about it at first, but being like this is like MVP insofar as like this is like something we feel is complete. Maybe not something we share out, but something we feel that is like a thing that we can recognize. And then we had like a soft launch, right? We had a waitlist launch of sorts for people to generate interest and get people knowing about what APM Map is and the fact that we're doing this thing. And I think even though like the full launch or the full reveal of what was being worked on wasn't until like the third, like the our actual launch, like publicly, it really helped having those in between stops because it kept a tight loop between me and product and like reminded me of what the value we were building was, while also like gives you that checkpoint to be like to like give yourself a break, like because I'm really like hard on myself basically. I'm like I want this to be perfect, right? But it'll never be perfect, and if you want it to be perfect, you'll never ship it. um, and I mean that's like the reality of it. So like the more we had some sort of concrete next step, the more I was willing to be like, all right, screw it, like we just have to ship it. And even if it's not actually being shipped, just the fact that you like sort of like write in, bubble in your last answer before you just like given the test, you're sort of just like, okay, whatever's done is done. But you have multiple chances to iterate and make it better, um, which just feels great because then you're like, oh, I wasn't done. I do have space for this, but
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It's a little bit like keep yourself in check, right? Like it took us 4 or 5 months to kind of bring this to life, but like it was always kind of living throughout the whole thing, right? It was always kind of like being tended to, and we were always like paying attention to it and like growing it here and cutting it down this way. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Kind
I
of
think
like a
it's super
keep at it.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's super interesting how, some of the phrases and the way you describe some of your processes mimic a lot of what we are used to just, in our work lives, right? You talk about releases, having these checkpoints, um,
Mhm.
and it's, I think sometimes we have the misconceptions like, oh, like all this extra bureaucracy and process that we have at work, it's pointless and like I hate it and like I wish I could just go without it. But kind of left to your own devices and given kind of a green field, you still do revert back to some of them at least, right? Like there is some value in having these sorts of defined roles and defined steps in the process to kind of rely on and fall back to.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I'll just huge plus one to that because I think like we didn't have like daily stand-ups or like weekly stand-ups or anything like that. So it wasn't like kind of it didn't really like get in our way in many ways, but it was still always good to be like, all right, we have a living document that we're commenting on and that like we have eyes on to sort of just like keep each other in check. So process
yeah.
isn't terrible. I'm tired of it most of the time though.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. So I guess like near in the end, I just wanted to end with kind of an open-ended question, right? What have you learned from working so closely with a product counterpart? I think this 50-50 product engineering balance is probably the highest ratio you're ever going to find on a team. But like what have you learned from working so closely from an engineering perspective, right? What is desirable and effective coming from a product point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in my experience working with a couple of PMs actually, so both professionally, but in this case specifically, it's almost always comes down to communication, right? Like being able to clearly and effectively, and specifically from an engineer, like get really specific about what the thing you were talking about is. I think that's kind of that's everything for me at least, right? Like I think being so close to the ground, I guess, right, and like seeing the code and seeing what's being changed, um, it's not only like a little frustrating, but it's also really confusing if like product comes and tries to communicate an idea that's like really loose and can mean like 50 different things to an engineer, because they're like you can't just say like homepage. They're like 50 different parts of the homepage at this point, right? Like which part of the homepage? Kind of trivial example, but I think that's that's super key. Being able to communicate is one of those like really undervalued. Well, it's probably pretty valued in fairness, um, but it's something that's especially important in like the day to day, right? Like describing something in a feature set and why it's important means being able to like get to the heart of it and be very, very kind of precise about what's being said. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I think
I
that
might be able to give more examples, but I'm blanking.
Yeah, I think precision and accuracy in communication, it's, like as you said, right, everyone says communication is important, but no one really breaks it down into what specifically it is. And I think precision and accuracy is a great way to put it, right? I think the homepage example was great. And, I've seen examples even just in my work, right, where kind of a misalignment or a miscommunication, like I thought I was referring to one part of the homepage, for example, whereas the engineers were thinking about another, and we kind of have this weird or unexpected results come out of it, right? So I think it's really good that you highlighted that.
Yeah, and I think just to add a bit more on that, I think it's also, and this is something I've learned kind of in my professional life, and I think wasn't really a problem for APM Map, but really being explicit, like trying to be descriptive more than you're prescriptive, in the sense of like saying what the value is, saying what's trying to be achieved, but like always try to give the potential avenues of how something's going to be built as open as possible, making those as open as possible, because if product is like, hey, this is a value and this is kind of the feature we want, um, like engineers and designers and like they're creative, we're creative people, right? So like we'll find some way to go about it. But I think, yeah, that I'll leave it at that, but that's kind of like going a little amendment to the communication thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, and that's a great place to end. I just want to follow up with one last final question. Coming out of this, would you want to be a PM?
Would I want to be a PM? Oh yeah, this is. I think I would. I think I would. I think I always knew kind of in the back of my mind. I was like, I wasn't just someone who's like, all right, leave me alone. I want to look down and code. Like that's always fun. I enjoy the focus time, but I think um, I do kind of love the role of like the product engineer, and we talked a bit about that. But being intimately tied to like what you're building and trying to be creative about it is really what a PM does. So it kind of goes hand in hand. So yeah, why not? I'm not there now, but in another life maybe.
That's great to hear. And it's great to hear that working with various PMs has not scarred you to the process yet. Great. Well, thank you so much for chatting. This has been wonderfully useful, and I think APM Map is a product that we're all familiar with. I know that I'm on the site. I've recommended it to a lot of people. So a big thank you for building it and continue to support it and continue to evolve and iterate on it. And can't wait to see what you guys do with it next.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me.